Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the new Tamron 150-500mm, and this is an F5-6.7 Di3 VC VXD. So we'll break down what all of that means, as Tamron likes to give you a mouthful of names for their lenses. And so in this case, Di3 is representative of the fact that this is designed for mirrorless. In this case, it is for Sony full frame E-mount, or FE. VC refers to the fact that this is the first of Tamron's full frame lenses for Sony to receive their VC, or vibration compensation, which is their optical stabilizer. And then also it has a VXD focus motor that we'll talk more about in just a moment, but that gives you lots of speed and torque to drive fast autofocus, which of course is what we're really looking for with a lens like this. To this point, I mean, obviously Sony's catalog has really fleshed out. They've got a lot of great lenses and a lot of focal lengths, a lot of choices. In fact, I would say more quality choices than what I've seen on any platform ever before. The exception to that rule has been on the telephoto end, where you still have some limited options, though thankfully we're starting to see a few third-party lenses that are starting to crack that code, including the Tamron 70-300mm that I reviewed last year, also a Sigma 100-400mm DN lens, and then of course this Tamron. To this point, you've kind of gone from two extremes to the other in terms of what's been available. The Sigma 100-400 DN is a more constrained focal length in terms of the telephoto end, not designed to work with teleconverters, so 400mm is the top limit. On the other end of the spectrum, you know, in the affordable range, we have got Sony's own 200-600mm f5.6-6.3 lens. I love this lens. I gave it a really glowing review. If you missed it, you can check it out here. And but obviously, this is a big lens, and comparatively, when they are in their fully retracted form, it's a really different lens, and that's particularly true when you've got the lens hood attached. And so we have gone from the fairly compact Sigma and fairly inexpensive to the far more expensive and way bigger 200-600mm GOSS lens from Sony. So Tamron has given us an option that kind of divides the difference between the two. No, it doesn't get all the way to 600mm, and as we're going to see, unfortunately, we are going to be constrained when it comes to using teleconverters, so 500mm is the upper limit. But 500mm is getting you into serious telephoto range, and so that obviously helps. Then also we've got a lens that is between the two in terms of size and also in terms of price. And so in many ways, Tamron has given us the kind of lens I think that for many photographers will kind of hit a sweet spot. It is retailing at right under $1,400 US, so about $600 cheaper than the Sony, but obviously we've got a serious size difference. Today's episode is brought to you by Ridge, the wallet redefined. Give your aching rear a break and ditch that bulky old wallet full of stuff you don't need and move to a sleek aluminum, titanium, carbon fiber, or even their new 18-karat gold Ridge wallet. It takes up little more room than a credit card, has RFID blocking technology to protect your valuable information, and comes with a lifetime warranty. Visit ridge.com/Dustin and use code Dustin to get 10% off your order, along with free shipping worldwide. Now today we're doing the definitive review where we look at everything in great detail and break everything down. If you want less detail, more to the point, you can check out the standard review instead. We're going to kick things off, however, by taking a closer look hands-on at what we have got here and the various aspects of the design that we see here. So once again, we have a very nicely made lens here from Tamron that, while it's not metals necessarily in the outside, it is high quality engineered plastics and feels substantial while not being too heavy. One thing I love is that you have an Arca Swiss compatible tripod foot here, which I simply don't understand why some manufacturers don't do that, including Sony with the 200-600G. And so in this case, you can go right to a tripod and just tighten it down without worrying about a quick release plate. And you also get really nice balance with that tripod foot. The tripod collar is removable and it can rotate to, whatever position you want. There's a locking knob to help to lock things down for that. Now the lens does have a full suite of weather sealing with a gasket at the rear lens mount, and then also seals along the switches, along the various rings, about 11 different seal points, or 11 or 12, and then also a flooring coating on the front element that also helps to repel water and oils from getting on that front element. It does come with a fairly shallow lens hood that does the job, but is made of engineered plastics and has a nice rubberized surface on that transition area where you're likely to set the lens down on. Always glad to see that. The lens itself, in terms of its overall dimensions, is about 210 millimeters in length, about 93 millimeters in diameter. It obviously does extend out a significant way when you are zooming it out. It is an externally zooming lens, unlike the Sony 200-600. So you can see how big that difference is with them, in their retracted position. But of course, then the Tamron gets more similar when you zoom it out. In this case, the weight is also fairly well controlled at 1.9 kilograms or 4.2 pounds. There are 4 different switches on the side of the lens, and so first of all, you actually have a focus limiter with a few different positions. You have an AF/MF switch, you have an on-off for the VC or vibration compensation, and then you've got 3 different modes to choose from. The stabilization seems to be effective. It's very hard to know what is lens stabilization and what is camera stabilization, but I'm assuming that they work in harmony in some way, though it's hard to separate, as I've said, what is doing what. Another nice feature here is they actually have a clutch mechanism on the zoom ring that allows you to lock that at any desired focus point. And so it works really well in the field. I like it a lot. Interestingly, there's also a standard locking mechanism on the side of the barrel as well for the 150 millimeter position. The focus ring is quite narrow. You can tell that they're not planning on you using that a whole lot, but it works just fine and gets the job done. Unfortunately, one other limitation is that this lens is not designed to work with teleconverters. It seems like Sony, it's an area where Sony is artificially limiting, and so the lens itself is not even designed to take teleconverters, and so you're going to have to use it in its bare form. What is here, however, is nicely made and handles very nicely in the field. This is a lot of lens for the money. So a few things that do stand out as a part of this lens, and that is obviously the size, as we've detailed as a part of this, but also the fact that Tamron has included some, new design elements, and in some ways they've kind of chosen their own path. This doesn't really have an identical feature set to a Sony or to the Sigma lens, which is largely followed Sony's kind of blueprint for various aspects. So we don't have a focus hold button here. I do really like the clutch mechanism. I think that that is a great addition. And then of course to have a full range of switches and various control options, very good, and a nice design to the lens or the tripod collar, lens tripod collar that's here. And I will note that it's got an attach point, which can be useful as a good place to attach a strap. One other thing that is worth highlighting here is that, like many recent Tamron lenses, there are 2 different minimum focus distances. And so on the closest end is actually at 150 millimeters, and it gives you your highest degree of magnification. And it's a very high degree of magnification. And at the 500 millimeter end, you're not really all that far off that. Both figures are extremely useful, but of course you get some flexibility as to how far away you need to be to capture those images. It gives you a lot more flexibility than what you've got with the Sony lens, which is only going to allow you to get as close as 2.4 meters, which is not particularly close, whereas the Tamron obviously is going to allow you to get a whole lot closer than that, and with a much higher degree of magnification. So one advantage for the Tamron lens. And so for the most part, I think that Tamron has checked all of the boxes here, and of course having the tripod foot Arca Swiss, I don't know why Sony didn't do that, but anyway, there's a few things that I like, but I think that what you've really seen here is that Tamron has given you a completely different alternative. I know that some of you are big fans of internally zooming lenses, and out in the field, I love the internally zooming design because, you know, it just allows you just very, very quick changes in focal length and no worry about any change in your balance. But as far as transporting, obviously this is a much more attractive package that's going to fit in a whole lot more carrying solutions relative to the bigger Sony lens. So, you know, it kind of gives an option to both people and both different philosophies. And it's, you know, the weather sealing, there's lots of seal points. I know that some of you are a little nervous about any externally zooming lens. And of course, it's too soon to tell how well it's going to hold up over the long haul. However, to this point, I've got a number of weather-sealed Tamron lenses that do extend when they zoom, and I haven't had a problem with getting dust or moisture in them. But I don't live in a hugely difficult, you know, atmosphere for that, not an extremely dusty climate or an extremely moist, as some of you do. And so obviously you're going to have to, you know, weigh that out for yourselves. Now, when it comes to the autofocus front, there is a lot of good that's going on here, and one unfortunate downside that's not lens specific, but is more of a Sony thing. And so let's dive in and let's take a look at autofocus. So let's talk about autofocus. Tamron has equipped the A057 with their VXD focus motor. The only other application I've seen of that is in the 70 to 180mm f2.8. VXD is an acronym for a more complicated series of words, but what it essentially means is that this is their high torque version of their linear motors. And so needed in an application like this, basically telephoto where you need a lot of speed, but you're moving bigger elements for telephoto lenses. And so VXD has only had a couple of applications at this point. It's a great focus system, however. I've loved all of the RXD focus motors as well. In this case, I think they needed a little more torque than what RXD can provide, and VXD does a great job with that. And so that translates into a number of ways. First of all, you know, all of the basic requirements that you would expect to be fulfilled and almost universally are these days. Focus motors are really doing a great job on Sony mirrorless for the most part in most every lens. And all of those basics are true here. I'm using it at the moment on the Alpha 1 to track my face for this particular sequence. And as you can probably tell, it's doing a great job of, you know, connecting with my eye and making sure that it keeps things in focus. And I found that to be true for general purpose shooting along the way. Focus is very fast, it is very quiet, and it is very accurate. And even if I move, you know, in and out towards the camera, even though the framing is tighter, obviously, with a telephoto like this, it does a good job of keeping up with tracking. Where I really wanted to drill down on this, however, is when it comes to high-speed action tracking. And that's really, I think, where the rubber needs to meet the road for a lens like this. And so I connected with my friends from Jengar Goldens once again, and we met at the beach with 4 of their dogs to do a number of sequences. And I'm just going to be showing you these sequences as we move ahead and giving you some of my observations that I culled from something around 1,300 different photos that I took as a part of this experience. And so I did direct comparisons with the 200 to 600 G lens from Sony, wanting to know how a first-party lens would compare. So first of all, the sequence that you're seeing right now is one that was really quite challenging in that I had the dogs backlit. They were running towards me, and I wanted those kind of bright, sparkling on the water to be bokeh kind of highlights in the background in the shot. The challenge for that, of course, is it means that the dogs are not front lit, and so they're running with their faces in shadow, which, you know, produces additional challenges. And what I did find is that as they got towards the end of the run and those bright, sparkling highlights got all the brighter, it did affect focus somewhat. But I got in that sequence, I got about an 87% keeper rate of well-focused shots. And so that's obviously pretty impressive. And when I did the same kind of thing with the 200 to 600 G, I got about a 92% keeper rate. And so, you know, within 5 percentage points is really not too shabby, all things considered. And when I put the lens into less demanding situations, that keeper rate just, you know, rose up even higher. You know, when I was either front lighting the subject, having them move laterally, and panning with them, I just got a much higher success rate. And so over the remaining shots, over 400, I only had about 10 that were, you know, improperly focused. And so a very high keeper rate there at that point. Now, the challenge is this, and that is that When I was primarily using like the A7R Mark III for testing, I didn't really notice a variance between first-party and third-party lenses, but as I added the A9 to my kit, and now even more obviously with the Alpha 1, it has become clear that Sony has imposed an artificial limit of 15 frames per second for third-party lenses. That's not a huge deal on the A9, you know, 5 frames per second is not a huge variance, but when it comes to the Alpha 1, you're talking about basically doubling the amount of frames per second you can get if you're using a first-party Sony lens like the 200-600G as opposed to this Tamron. And that is an unfortunate limitation that's only going to affect a small percentage of potential buyers, obviously, but it is a factor to consider if you're using either an A9 series camera or an Alpha 1, and that you are going to run into that limitation if you don't buy a first-party Sony lens. That's not on Tamron, obviously. They've done a fantastic job with this focus system, but it is something you're going to have to bear in mind because it is a limitation that Tamron does have to deal with. As far as the focus system goes, in most all situations, however, it did a fantastic job. Definitely a cut above what I saw from the Sigma 100-400 millimeter DN lens that I tested last year. We're just getting a higher keeper rate, greater success rate, more shots in focus and in a wider variety of situations. So as far as the third-party options, I think Tamron's at the top of the heap. However, if you have one of Sony's action cameras, you might want to consider a Sony branded lens for the simple reason that you're going to unlock the full burst rate potential of your camera by doing so. So as you can see, really a great job in terms of tracking performance and tracking accuracy. This lens does everything you would want an autofocus system to do. And my experience has been there really isn't much difference between first-party Sony and Tamron lenses with the better focus motors like RXD or VXD. Not really any difference that I am seeing. And so, that part is all good. However, if you're using one of Sony's higher end bodies like the Alpha 9 or Alpha 1 sports cameras, you're gonna have to make that determination whether or not 15 frames per second is enough for you. I suspect for many people it is, but obviously if you're buying an Alpha 1, you kind of want to get that full 30 frames per second, which means that you might want to consider a lens like that. So let's talk about image quality. Obviously, for many photographers, I think there's probably enough boxes that have been checked to this point, but is the image quality going to hold up in comparison with the big dog from Sony? Let's jump in, let's take a look. So first of all, let's just take a look at this focal length, focal range. So we can see we start from 150 millimeters and we can zoom in to 500 millimeters. So that's obviously going to be really, really versatile, give you a lot of control for how you frame different scenes. And so that's part of the value, obviously, of a zoom lens like this. Now, surprisingly, vignette and distortion are quite mild throughout the whole zoom range, which is unusual in my experience. You can see that there is some pincushion distortion here. I used between a 5 and a 6, a -5 to a -6 to correct for it with a manual correction, and then about a +24 to correct for the vignette, and I slid the midpoint over to 0 to give a nice linear correction, but you can see that it's a very good end result, and that's not using the standard profile, which will be along shortly, and already video and JPEGs will be corrected in camera for these aberrations. Moving on to the 500 millimeter end, and you can see that if anything, the pincushion distortion is a little more mild. It's only about a -4 to correct for it. Likewise with the vignette, very surprising to me. I only needed about a +21, +22, and again with the midpoint slid over to 0 to give a very nice linear correction. Also getting high marks is the aberration control. Here we can see a really high contrast edge with bright sunlight coming through on these irises. You can also see the nice close-up performance. But what we can also see is that there is just no real evidence of any kind of chromatic aberrations either before the plane of focus or if we move beyond the plane of focus after it. And so really, really well-controlled aberrations. Another example here where you have all of these water droplets with light going through them. So, and at varying depths of field. And so you have lots of opportunity for fringing, purple or green fringing in this situation. But you can see as we look through the image that it's nice and dynamic and there is no color fringing anywhere to be seen. So let's take a look at our resolution results. And so I've got a smaller test target that I use for longer telephotos just so I can fit in terms of space. And you can see here that this, by the way, is on the 50 megapixel Sony Alpha 1. And so at a 200% magnification, we can see in the center of the frame at 150 millimeters that this lens is beautifully sharp with really fantastic contrast. And the details on this old bill are just rendered really fantastically. And if we look at our corner performance, we can see that while it's not as intensely good in terms of the contrast or detail as what we saw in the center of the frame, it is still quite good. So we're going to use the 200 to 600 millimeter G lens as a point of comparison. Now I will point out that maximum aperture is only f5.6 relative to f5, and of course we start at 200 millimeters, but it's still instructive to see on the telephoto end of things how they compare. And so we can see that the Tamron is very, very close, very similar in performance, and I don't think that either one of them necessarily stands out in the center of the frame. Both are rendering very, very high amounts of detail. And, you know, technically the Sony is on the MTF ever so slightly better in terms of contrast. And I can see that in a tiny way, but it's not significant. And if we move off towards the edge of the frame, we can see that here the Sony has a little bit more advantage. Textures are just a little bit more crisp, but again, it's not by a wide margin. And so, I mean, this is an exceptionally good lens, probably the best of this type that I've ever reviewed in the Sony. And so the fact that the Tamron is as good in the center of the frame, you know, arguably most important, and nearly as good in the corners is quite impressive. Stopping down to f5.6 produces slightly more contrast, but already detail was very good. You can just see that those textures pop a little bit more due to increasing contrast. Stopping on down to f8 makes a more noticeable improvement in overall textures and sharpness. Understandable since the other was just a third stop really. And you can see now that at f8 the corners are also looking sharper with more detail in this text that is here and also in just the rendering of the face of the Prime Minister there. At 200 millimeters, you can see that it is still holding the maximum aperture of f5, so it does have an advantage at 200 millimeters versus the Sony in terms of maximum aperture. We can also see that, once again, detail is very good in the center of the frame, and you can see a slight bit more improvement maybe at f5.6 relative to our opening. Moving off into the corner, we can see that corner performance is actually better here at 200 millimeters than what I saw at 150 millimeters, and it is ever so slightly better still stopped down to f5.6. Stop on down to f8 and we can see that contrast and resolution is crisper still, and you know, texture and detail is really jumping off the page. And if we look down here at like the very small print, you can see how clearly it's being rendered, you know, from some distance away. Moving on to 300 millimeters, again, maximum aperture is f5.6 at 300 millimeters, and so it's doing a fairly good job of holding maximum apertures. We haven't yet got into the smaller aperture sizes yet. We can see that the excellent detail continues here, and so at f5.6, very crisp in the center of the frame. At f8, there is a mild uptick in contrast. It's not as significant because the lens, I think, is a little bit kind of sharper to begin with. And moving off to the edge of the frame, you mostly see it in increased brightness in the image itself, that, you know, a little bit of a vignette lift and just a little slightly better contrast. But once again, a very strong performance here, you know, on through 300 millimeters. So we can see near 400 millimeters, we're now to that aperture of f6.3, so we'd be matching the Sony at this stage. No real advantage for either one. Once again, however, detail very nice in the center of the frame, better still at f8. Quite impressive again by the f8 mark. And looking up here into the corner, we can see that detail is good, contrast getting better as you stop down to f8, and you can see once again that the text here is all very, very crisp. Now at 500 millimeters, we've reached our smallest maximum aperture of f6.7, so it's really only at this juncture that the Sony does have any aperture advantage in this particular zoom range, but we're going to check in once again against the Sony to see how it compares.
So in the center of the frame, we can see that both lenses are exceptionally good, with the Sony maybe having a very slight edge in terms of overall contrast and just a slight bit richer rendering of a few details. You can see it's very close, but just that the, like our blacks are a little bit darker on the Sony. And looking at this text, you can just see its contrast is a little bit stronger. But once again, I mean, both of these are delivering an exceptionally good result. Moving off into the corner, however, and the advantage really grows for the Sony. And it's in this place that I see the biggest advantage between the two lenses. And so you can see that corner performance is just exceptional on the Sony. If we look down at this text, it's pretty, noticeable how much better the contrast and detail rendering is near the edge of the frame. That advantage is there at the mid frame. I'll just show you where we're looking at here in the overall chart. So down here, and so it's not as significant, but you can still see that the contrast and slightly a little bit more detail rendered by the Sony lens. Stopping the Tamron down to f8, you can see that it's gained most of what the Sony had there in terms of contrast there in the mid frame. And we'll take a peek back up here in the corner, and you can see that in the corner things are improved somewhat, but certainly not to the level we saw from the Sony. All things being considered, however, this is an extremely strong optical performance and pretty much matching what is the best lens in the class, I think, optically. Now with a lens like this, you can also go to very small apertures, smallest being on the telephoto end of f32, but at f32 you're really running up against the limiting principle of diffraction, and you can see that a lot of contrast has been lost. And so I don't recommend shooting at these smallest aperture settings. Typically I like to stay at f11 or larger just to get maximum image quality out of my lenses. Now we saw earlier how that there is a great amount of magnification here, and so this shows how that maximum magnification is on the 150mm end. And so you can see that we don't have a perfectly flat plane of focus, quite obviously, but in the area of focus you can see that you're getting very close to a macro type performance in terms of just so much of the details of the actual ink that is being rendered here and the fine lines. Really quite impressive. If we go to the 500mm end, it's still not a perfectly flat plane of focus, but it is a flatter plane of focus, so that might be something to bear in mind depending on your subject. And once again, we can see that zoomed into a pixel level, we have got really nice detail, just not quite to the same level as what we saw at the 150mm mark. Now, long telephoto lenses have a kind of a built-in, baked-in advantage when it comes to bokeh, and that their compression really has the tendency to just blur out backgrounds into something really soft and creamy. The depth of field is remarkably small, and so you can get really nice detail on subject, but a really creamy background. And in almost all cases, I was really impressed with the bokeh quality I saw out of this lens. It actually produces really lovely looking images, and in many cases, you're going to have a highly defocused background and just a great look to images. And even at this more moderate distance where you can see the background's a little bit closer, there is some transition zone here on this image. I didn't really find it looked too bad, however, and the detail is nice on Loki's face, and then you can see that the background is nicely defocused. So overall, I would say the bokeh rendering is quite nice from the lens. Now the A057 received Tamron's second generation B-bar coatings. Their B-bar coatings have been pretty much uniformly excellent, and even though it is rare to have the sun right in the frame with a lens like this that has such a narrow angle of view, here of course I've intentionally put it in the frame, and you can see that it has really done a great job of being resistant to the flare here with minimal ghosting, minimal veiling, and the B-bar coatings just do a great job. So overall, we have a very strong optical performance from this lens.
So a lot of really good things to take away there. I found flare resistance to be great. Colors look great. The bokeh and just the general rendering of images looks really great. And so I have no complaints on that front. And you're getting, I would say about 95 to 97% of the image quality in terms of sharpness and resolution as what you're getting on the 200 to 600mm, particularly on the the wide end, but even at the telephoto end, it's quite competitive. And so, the good news is you're not really giving up much in terms of image quality and getting it in a more attractive compact package, if that is your preference. When it comes to the difference in the maximum aperture on the telephoto end, F6.7 is it's 1/3 stop slower than F6.3, and sure, I would love to see F5.6 on both of these lenses, but it would mean that you're going to get a larger, heavier, more expensive lens. So that's the trade-off, and these days with modern mirrorless bodies, both of them focus without any kind of problem. And really the only place where you're going to see slowdown is in really low light conditions. But truth be told, these are not lenses designed for very, very low light conditions. They're designed more for, shooting in the daytime, or at dusk, sunrise, the time when you're out shooting birds in flight, for example, or wildlife. But these aren't really event type lenses designed to shoot in very low light conditions. In many stadiums, you'll probably get by fine, and, particularly the sports that are reasonably well lit, I think you won't have any problems with that. But obviously, if you're wanting to get really fast shutter speeds in low light conditions, you're going to have to invest in the more expensive glass. And when you go beyond this point, it gets really expensive really fast. That's the world in which we live, and there's always compromises. But the good news is we've got a solid new choice on Sony for telephoto work, and one that's in a very attractive package, and I think at a very competitive price of $1,399 US. This is a lot of lens for the money, and certainly well worth your consideration, particularly if you don't need all the way up to 20 or 30 frames per second on a Sony sports body. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. Also linkage to an image gallery. Go check out photos, well worth seeing. And beyond that, there are some buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. Also linkage there for you to check out the Let the Light In merch, DA lens gear. So check that out as well. There's also links to follow me on social media, to become a patron, sign up for my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Be sure to ring that bell to get notification when new content drops. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.